This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy and TNC chapters throughout the western United States. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the last Tuesday of every month throughout 2024, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions in the American West and beyond. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in the West and around the world, visit www.nature.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Kevin Krasnow. Kevin is the Conservation Director at the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance, a long-standing, highly effective organization whose mission is to, quote, protect the wildlife, wild places, and community character of Jackson Hole. For more than 4 decades, the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance has been a staunch advocate for keeping Jackson Hole wild and beautiful, and it's proven to be a nimble and creative protector of the legendary Wyoming Valley. The organization has served as a watchdog against poorly planned development, a champion for public land, a community voice that holds elected officials accountable, and much more. Kevin brings a fascinating and diverse professional background to his work at the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance. He's worked as an outward bound instructor, a high school teacher, a college professor, and most notably, he earned a Ph.D. in environmental science, policy, and management from the University of California Berkley. Before joining the team at the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance, he worked for 10 years at the Teton Science Schools in Jackson. As you'll hear in our conversation, Kevin is a high-level expert in forest and wildlife ecology, and he speaks eloquently about the role of wildfires in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem and beyond. When I first headed out west from North Carolina nearly 20 years ago, I moved to Jackson Hole, and I'll always have a tender spot in my heart for that particular area. So I was thrilled to have the opportunity to connect with Kevin and talk about all things related to ecology, wildlife, fire, and conservation in Jackson Hole. We started with a deep dive into aspen trees and why they're such an important and unique part of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. We discussed the Yellowstone Fire of 1988 and how that disaster shaped forest management into the future. We talk about the unprecedented development pressure in and around Jackson, how Kevin and his organization collaborate with a wide range of conservation partners, his professional journey from indirect to direct conservation work, and how his career as an educator informs his work today. If you've ever spent time in the Tetons, Yellowstone, or the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, then you're going to learn a lot from Kevin. Please visit the episode notes for a full list of everything we discussed, and I hope you enjoy. All right, Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. We ended up chatting quite a bit before I hit record, and I'm super interested in everything you're doing from, your entire career. I feel like I've got a kind of, even where you're born in Colorado Springs, where I am right now. But the hard thing with talking with people like you is, where do we start? And I want to start with aspen trees. And you've got this amazingly diverse career that's kind of wound in a lot of different really, really cool directions. And I was wondering, how did aspens capture your attention enough that you decided, all right, I want to spend a good bit of my brain power, lifetime digging into this very particular tree?
That's a good question. First off, Ed, thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for the invitation. What a privilege to talk with you and your listeners here. And what a good question. Aspen. Well, I would say, what really caught me was just the beauty of the tree, of the organism. Who doesn't love to sit, or if you haven't sat in an aspen stand and just listen to the leaves quiver above you? It's called quaking aspen for a reason. You're missing out. It's a tremendously beautiful tree, white trunks, really bright green foliage. It turns yellow in the fall. So I think its beauty was what first caught me. And then the complexity of the organism and how much we don't know about it. I think that's what really intrigued me. And with aspen, it was really around how the organism reproduces. it used to be thought that, well, let's back up a little bit and tell the listeners just a little bit about the organism. Aspen is a clonal tree species. So when you're in an aspen stand and you have a bunch of aspen trees around you, it's likely just one organism. They're all connected underground. It's just one tree with a bunch of stems coming out of the ground. So it's this immense root system that runs laterally under the ground and connects to all these different stems, or ramets as we call them. But, they're trees to the observer, but they're not individuals. They're connected underground. And so just how that works, how they can do that, how long they've been alive. I mean, the biggest aspen stand is over 100 acres large. I was just there last summer. Amazing, called Pando in Utah. And we don't know how old it is. There's ideas that it's thousands of years old. It's a relic from the retreating glaciers from the Pleistocene, last ice age. And that could be true. And so it's incredible. But that really intrigued me. And we used to think that these trees just reproduced, almost exclusively asexually by sprouting, by growing the roots out and then sprouting new stems. And slowly, one tree could make more and more, and the stand would expand over time. But they make prolific seeds. Every year they make tons of seeds. They're tiny seeds. They're about as big as a sesame seed. They're encased in a little bit of cotton puff, kind of like a cottonwood seed. They fly through the air. They're just dispersed by the wind. And it used to be thought that, virtually none of these seeds survived. Seedlings were, very rare occurrence of aspen. And so I went to examine that. I wanted to examine that. There had been some observations of seedling success after fires. And so when I went to graduate school, I was really interested in forests and fires, and I really wanted to understand how are aspen reproducing by seeds. And the thought was that it was probably more common than we thought, and I was going to go out there and find some seedlings. And so I started looking for aspen stands that had burned in the Sierra Nevadas, and just started getting out in the field and looking around. And sure enough, I found quite a few seedlings out there, and we marked them and monitored them over the years, and found that actually reproduction by seed is pretty important, more common than we thought, and probably is going to be really important for aspen to climate change, to potentially move. The seeds can move a lot faster than the organism can asexually. So it was my curiosity about the organism that really kind of lit that fire under me to understand what was going on.
I'm curious, this may be a silly question, but why was or is so little known about the organism? Because it seems that, it's pretty in your face when anybody that comes to the West, especially if you come in the fall, it's one of the first things people notice. And it would seem that people, would have been pretty heavily researched all along. Is there a reason why there's so much kind of mystery still around aspens?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the main mystery is that it's hard to see. It's hard to see what's going on. It's hard to differentiate a seedling from a sprout. And they're going to be out there after fire. Most of what you see are going to be sprouts from pre-existing roots. There are differences. They're subtle, and it took me a while to understand what they were. They've been documented more in the literature now, and so more people are out there finding the difference. But I think frankly, what it gets to is it's hard to see. A lot of it is going on underground, and we don't have good ways to observe what's happening underground. We're still trying to understand how to learn about what's going on underground. There's some cool techniques that folks are doing. So I think it was kind of hidden from us, and I think it was a good, attractive story that these stands were just reproducing asexually, that they were super old, and it kind of made sense at the surface level. It didn't start to break down until you really started to dig deep into it. So it was a story that worked for a while until we I guess tried to really test it.
I'm curious about I hear kind of different stories about where the health of aspen and kind of the trajectory of the species and where it's going. Here in Colorado, just anecdotally, reading things or hearing stuff, not actually talking to scientists, but like here in Colorado, we've got such a problem with the pine beetle and beetle kill. And I've heard it's stuck in my brain that people have said, well, if a whole side of a mountain is killed, if the pines are killed by the pine beetle, aspen are going to take its place. But then I've seen other things that say that there are real stresses on aspen population because of climate change. And I think I was actually looking at one of pretty old, almost 10 years old now, presentation you had done about aspens. And I think there was something in there about some modeling that had been done saying, showing the potential decline in aspen by the year 2090. And so very high level question, but like what are the challenges facing aspen going forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the way I like to think about this is that it's kind of a counterbalance between those forces that are going to be challenges to aspen versus those forces that are going to be kind of opportunities for aspen. And both are going to exist. And so like the challenges for aspen are going to be increased aridity, increased drying out, increased drought. It is a drought sensitive species. The seedlings, as I talked about, the seedlings have very exacting requirements for soil moisture and solar radiation. We thought they didn't reproduce by seed for so long because most of their seedlings die. If they establish somewhere, most of them will dry out and die before they establish. So they need very kind of exacting, and soil moisture is important, especially for establishment. And so places that are drying out, places that are having more drought, climate change is certainly shifting around precipitation patterns and temperature and humidity patterns that are really changing the climate envelope for aspen. And that's the modeling that you saw out to 2090. I think it's a Rayfeld paper that you were looking at. And they basically looked at the climate envelope for aspen. What's the climate that supports aspen? And then they modeled out using climate models to say, where is this envelope going to be in the future? And kind of what they saw is that it kind of evaporated off of, the United States. A lot of it moved into Canada. You can see that, I think, from the maps that were in that presentation. But yeah, it moved north. Some of it evaporated away. And so that's going to be a challenge for aspen is a change in climate and increased aridity. The opportunities for aspen are going to be increased fire. We know aspen does well after wildfires. And so increased fire certainly could be an advantage for aspen to get in there as an early successful species. It's good at resprouting if it's already there. It also, as we're understanding, it can move via seeds, and high severity fires are the places where its seeds are more likely to establish. So fire certainly could be an advantage in the future. And then, anything that's going to disrupt its competitors like conifers, like lodgepole pines, so mountain pine beetles or other bark beetle outbreaks that affect conifers. Those could be localized advantages for aspen to move into those spaces that are opened up by bark beetles or other insect infestations, budworms, other things that might kill their competitors. Of course, keep in mind aspen has a whole slew of diseases and insects that will attack it. And so that's part of the diversity of the forest system.
Yeah, I'm just, I think like anybody who is not from the West, when you come out here, I think I moved actually to where you are right now. I moved to Jackson in September of 2005, and the aspens were just starting to change when I rolled into the Valley of Canyon Pass. It's just like breathtaking. Beautiful. And so fire, we could spend 3-4 hours just talking about fire. But in preparation for this, I read a decent amount about the Yellowstone fires of 1988. And I know that you've focused some of your attention on that. And I found it very, very fascinating. And I was wondering if you could just kind of give an overview of what that event was, because I think given all the fires that have happened since 2000, people very well may have forgotten, or people outside of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem very well may have forgotten about that. Can you talk a bit about that, and then how that's been a kind of a case study for building some really good knowledge around the role that fire plays up there in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem?
Yeah. Good question. And I would say, the Yellowstone fires are a foundational event in I think, American fire science, in our understanding of fire ecology, and I think worldwide, and just the recognition of the role that the natural role that fire has played in ecosystems, and really are the Western misunderstanding of that. And so let's start with the fire itself. 1988. Typically the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem gets a decent amount of rain in the summer. Here in Jackson, we get about an inch of rain each month in the summer, and we get about 12 inches a year. So it's kind of distributed around the year. And obviously in the winter it comes as snow. In the summer it becomes more as rain. But if we don't get that rain in the summer, and that happens occasionally, we don't get that rain, the fire season really starts to pick up, and it starts to get dry. And the forests that we have in this area, and I'm going to differentiate here, and this is a really important differentiation for folks, is that different forests have different fire regimes. And that's what we talk about as a fire science or fire ecology. We talk about fire regime. It's not just how one fire burns. We're looking over hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, depending on the scope, to see what's the pattern of fire. How frequent are they? Do they usually kill most of the trees? How big is the fire? What are the patterns? Are there winds associated with them? All of these things are there cultural burns? Are people igniting fires purposely to manage the forest? These are all parts of a fire regime. And if that goes on for long enough, that's basically what the animals and plants have evolved with. And that's what their adaptations are, that's what they're adapted for. And so that kind of historic range of variability, or understanding how has fire interacted with an ecosystem in the past, is critically important to understand what did those organisms evolve with, and kind of how are they adapted today? What are they expecting today in terms of fire and disturbance? And so I'll separate two main forest types, and there's a lot of diversity in between, but just for simplification, we have frequent fire forests, those forests that are burning frequently. And some examples of forests like that would be like the western slope of the Sierra Nevadas. Again, these are broad generalizations. Or the front range of Colorado Rockies. Those, places that have ponderosa pine, which is a long 3-needle pine. Ponderosa pine is generally indicative of a frequent fire forest. There's disagreement on the edges there, but generally that's a forest that's going to burn more often. I'm going to contrast that with a infrequent fire forest, and that's the type of forest that we have here. These are the higher elevation forests, the more moist forests, the forests that are wetter, and they tend to have a different set of species. And so fir spruce is the forest type at the higher elevations. That's what we have a lot here. Fir spruce, higher elevations. Lodgepole pine and aspen also they will fit into that forest type. And these forests are, they're dense. They have a lot of fuel in them, but they tend to be cold and moist. And so the conditions under which they'll burn don't happen that often. And when they do happen, the fires are big. They kill most of the trees, but they're infrequent. Okay. And we'll compare that to the frequent fire forests that, almost every summer they're getting dry enough to burn. And historically they burned pretty frequently. And that would be like maybe every 5 to 20 years. Again, a lot of spatial and temporal variability, but those frequent fires kept those forests from accumulating too many fuels, and they didn't kill the old mature trees. They just burned in the understory. Ponderosa pine has a very thick bark. Doug fir also is in those forests. Some other trees that can survive those low intensity fires, those frequent fires. And that's a really different system than the infrequent fire system where, the fires are infrequent, they kill almost all the trees, and it kind of resets the forest. So let's differentiate different fire regimes for different forests and understand that there's a lot of spatial and temporal variability in fires. But we can generalize by forest type around the fires that they evolved with and the fires that the organisms are adapted for. And so in the Greater Yellowstone, we have those higher elevation, more moist forests that tend to not burn as often. And when they burn, it's pretty severe. So, when the Yellowstone fires happened in 88, it was one of those summers where we just really didn't get the precipitation. It was just dry. And basically a fire started, and that fire started more fires started, and these fires started kind of building on each other, super dry, super windy, super warm. And we had thousands of firefighters out there fighting this fire, but they really couldn't make much of a dent in it. And the news coverage was amazing. There were helicopter footage of this catastrophe burning the first national park. That's how it was treated. It was treated as if our first national park was being destroyed. And that's kind of what we thought. That was the popular vision of what this fire was doing. It burned for months. It burned over 30% of Yellowstone Park.
That's crazy.
And it was treated as a catastrophe. We spent millions of dollars fighting the fire. We were able to save the Old Faithful Inn, which is just an amazing feat by these amazing firefighters that were out there. Ultimately, what put this fire out was snow, was a change in the weather. And that's typically what puts these incredibly intense, infrequent fires out is a change in the weather. Because our firefighting forces may be able to save a building here or there, but it's unsafe to get in front of these fires, and we can't make much of a dent in putting them out when they're burning under these conditions with heavy fuels, high winds, low humidities. It's not safe for firefighters to get in front of it. And there's not a lot we can do in those, 97th to 99th percentile conditions of weather. That's kind of how we look at it. It's just these extreme conditions. And those are the conditions under which the forests here burn. And they burn intensely and they kill most of the trees. The punchline of the story is that it wasn't a catastrophe, that it ruined the park. Is if you go to Yellowstone now, you'll see that it's covered with healthy forests. These forests regenerated. Lodgepole and specifically, lodgepole and aspen specifically are really well adapted to regenerate after a severe fire like this. Lodgepole has incredible serotinous cones. If the listeners haven't seen or heard about these, just an amazing adaptation. These cones that will stay closed and hold on to seeds for decades until they're heated by a fire, in which, the fire usually kills a tree, but it doesn't kill the cone or the seeds. It opens the cone. And after the fire moves through, the seeds fall out. They fall into the perfect place to regenerate the next lodgepole forest. And Yellowstone is carpeted with these forests that were born in 1988 when the lodgepole cones opened up after this amazingly intense fire. They're also carpeted with aspen stands that regenerated after those fires. Aspen, as we just talked about, can resprout from roots that survived these intense fires, and well-documented new stands of aspen seedlings out there in Yellowstone as well. So we understood from this fire, after many, many decades of research afterwards, that it wasn't a catastrophe, that these animals and plants were well adapted to this fire that was well within the historic range of variability. We didn't really understand at the time. We had never observed a fire like this before because we had only been observing for 100 years or, the Forest Service started in 1906. We hadn't been here long enough. Fires like this in Yellowstone, the return interval, 100 to 300 years. We hadn't even been here long enough to really understand the full range of what was possible. And, I'll stop here to say that one big impact that Western expansion had in the United States was this kind of purposeful genocide of the native peoples that were living here. They had very specific and very effective forest management strategies and range management and all kinds of other ecosystems, but fire was an integral part of their tool belt. A lot of native cultures and peoples use fire to manage the forest, to get the growth they needed for basket making or to encourage herbaceous growth for wildlife or to clear out brush for their own agriculture or other desirable plants to grow. So well documented. A lot of this traditional ecological knowledge, unfortunately, has been lost or is in silos now. That's not accessible to the general public. And these native cultures had watched the environment for so long that they understood they understood the natural role. They wouldn't have been surprised by the Yellowstone fires. Whereas, the European culture that came over here didn't have the same type of fire in Europe. A lot of the forestry professionals that were trained in Germany didn't understand wildfire and its natural role. And so, we've got a lot of makeup work to do now because we misunderstood the role of fire in Western forests for most of the time we've been managing Western forests.
When I hear you discussing that, I think about that book called The Big Burn by Timothy Egan and how, Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot just made it their mission to suppress fires at all costs. And I can only imagine how both of them would have been freaking out if Yellowstone, to see Yellowstone on fire. But obviously there's just this momentum with the Forest Service and just with general protocols and thinking about fire of suppression. But after seeing something like this in 88 and in the decades after, seeing that it was actually, just part of the natural cycle, has that led to any sort of changes? I mean, obviously it's led to some different ways of thinking about it in the scientific community, but has it changed anything as far as like actual on the ground forest management, whether that's in Yellowstone or anywhere else?
Yeah, I think for sure it really opened the eyes of a lot of scientists and forest managers to the natural role of fire in systems. It's opened up, I think, a lot of forest management, fire management organizations to ask the question, when is fire doing important ecological work? When do we want to have fire on the ground? More recently, it's led to more and more desire to get prescribed fire, to actually purposely ignite fires in places that have been missing fire for a long time or are due for fires, or to burn something when we have more control over the smoke and how it's going to burn rather than wait for an uncontrolled fire. So yeah, I think there's been a lot of learning since then, but there's also a lot of challenges. It's not like we can just learn, oh, okay, we can allow fire to burn. These ecosystems need fire. Well, we've got 100 years of problems to deal with now in terms of past forest management. There was a lot of logging, grazing, and mining that really kind of messed with the species mix of what's out there. The age of the forest is different now. We also have developed flammable homes in a lot of these fire adapted ecosystems, and so allowing fire to come back to the ecosystem is not as simple as letting the next fire burn, because now we have values at risk, as they're called, human values at risk out there that need to be protected, and that really is a critical hurdle for allowing fire to play the natural role in the landscape. Living out here, coming from California to Wyoming and now being in Jackson, just juxtaposing the landscape is incredible. Here in the Tetons, they have an incredible opportunity to allow wildfire to burn because the landscape is not dotted with flammable homes, or there's not a lot of private inholdings in these large blocks of public open lands. The topography also helps. It's so mountainous and high elevation and snowy and cold here that it's much harder to build and to live here. But if you juxtapose that with like the western slope of the Sierras or the front range of the Rockies, where there's massive exurban expansion, the wildland-urban interface intermixes with these flammable landscapes, much harder to allow wildfire to play its natural role. And that's where, the hard work of prescribed fire comes in, the hard work of mechanical treatments to try to emulate some of the ecological work that fire does, or just really to reduce fuel loads around communities to help protect these values at risk. That's the type of hard work that we need to implement on the ground now to better protect our communities from wildfire, to better, protect these ecosystems from lack of wildfire, to allow some of these ecosystems to burn, when and where that's appropriate.
You speaking about the more flammable homes, I had never even considered that. And then I read a book called Fire Weather by John Valiant, and I had him on the podcast. And it's kind of several different parts of the book. One is around this big fire that happened in Alberta, Canada, but then it's also an examination of kind of a history of the fossil fuels industry. And there's a part where he talks about basically how everything is made out of oil now, and houses are just made out of these petroleum products. And there was an experiment some folks did where they took a house, say from the 1940s, and then put another one from the mid 2000s, and then did a burn test on them. And they started out about the same, but then once the fire got going, the new one just basically exploded compared to the other. Yeah. So people want to hear more about that, they can go to that. So this brings me to your work at the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance. Obviously, when I lived there, I was aware of the organization. And then as I was getting ready for this interview, I was looking at the history of the organization and all the different things that y'all have done over the years. I mean, everything from preventing a Walmart from bulldozing this pasture or a meadow and building there, to some crazy thing where somebody was trying to build a water park up near the elk refuge or something. I mean, so you've just had this amazing, yeah. Man, I used to be in the real estate business. I would see the silliest ideas, but you've just done so much. The organization has done so much over such a long period of time and had such great impact. So, and you're relatively new. So what attracted you to bring your skills and expertise to the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance? Yeah,
thanks, Ed. Thanks for looking into that. Yeah, it's a privilege to work here. We're on our 45th year of protecting the wildlife, the wild places, and community character of Jackson Hole. And, I too knew about the Alliance, the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance, from some friends that work here and the work that they had been doing, for the decade I've lived here before taking this job. And I think what really attracted me to it was, their advocacy, their diehard advocacy for this place that I have come to love and to call home, their familiarity with this place, their intimate connection to the place, the people, and the culture of the Tetons, and their willingness to kind of put themselves out there to speak for really the the wildlife, the plants, the animals, that they can't speak for themselves. There's so many bad ideas about how to use land out here. There's so much money in development, and real estate has become so valuable here that it's really imperative that we really put a check on ideas for how to use land here, like how we use land. That's like what decision is more important than how we use land, especially in a place like this, where we still have these iconic herds of migrating wildlife that need to move through our community to complete their migration routes. We're living, in their winter habitat in some places. So our communities need to be permeable to wildlife in order for these herds to sustain themselves and for us to have them for our grandchildren, our children. And so I think how we use land is such an important and critical question that, I think we're fortunate, the community, to think hard about how we make decisions about how we use land here, and really trying to speak for the conservation of wildlife and wild processes, because frankly, there's so many people that want to be in places like this, and if everyone that wants to be in a place like this is here, we're probably going to love the place to death.
Yeah, no question. And I would imagine, I'd love to hear just kind of how, if anything, how the urgency of your work has changed since COVID, because I feel like when COVID started, I thought the real estate markets were just going to crash. And I mean, it was there was so much unknown. And then basically the exact opposite happened. In all these rural/resort areas, the real estate prices just blew up, and there was this influx of wealth. I mean, Jackson has had plenty of wealth for many decades now, but it seems like it went on steroids. And so I would imagine there's some opportunity there, because there's people who come in and have the right mindset. They can fund some of your work, but then there are other people who may not have the respect and the similar way of thinking about things. How has the last 4 years, which is crazy, it's been 4 years, how has that affected the work of the Conservation Alliance?
Yeah, I think it's made our work even more critical. As you said, no one was sure what was going to happen during COVID, but really what happened was, I think it increased the desire and the ability for people to be here. A lot more people found out about mountain towns like this, and then a lot of people had the opportunity to work remotely or pick up a business and move it. Wyoming doesn't have any state income taxes, and so it's an advantageous place for business owners to be here. And so basically, COVID just put a fire under the already steep rise in real estate prices, in cost of living here, and really just in the pressure on housing. We have such a hard time housing our workforce here, and yet people are still willing to pay more and more for real estate here, and it's just pricing local workers out. And so we have this problem where obviously land is so incredibly valuable here. Teton County, which is where Grand Teton National Park is, and it's the lower part of Yellowstone National Park, 97% of the county is public lands, which is incredible. But only 3% of the county is privately held, and so there's not a lot of private land here. There's not a lot of housing here, and the housing that's here is incredibly expensive. And so we run into this conflict sometimes between housing and habitat and wildlife permeability, and our community is struggling to figure out, how do we maintain our community character, and how do we allow people that have been living here for decades not to be priced out of their home? I mean, real estate taxes alone are pricing people out of their homes, people on fixed incomes. So COVID has really changed the nature of how expensive it is to live in a place like this. It's also changed the nature of who's able to afford to live in a place like this. And as you said, there's some advantages that go with that. There's also some challenges in that we have a lot of people that aren't used to living in the mountains or living with wild neighbors like grizzly bears or elk or moose, living here and not understanding what kind of decisions need to be made to accommodate our wildlife. How, even leaving food outside is something that we can't do here, especially in the summer when wildlife can have access to that. So there are really specific ways about living in a place like this so that we can coexist with wildlife. And actually last year, the Conservation Alliance, we put out our first human-wildlife coexistence monitoring report, and it was over 20 metrics from our community around how well we're coexisting with wildlife. And this was everything from human or wildlife vehicle collisions to bear conflicts to invasive species outbreaks and treatment areas. And so what we're trying to do is monitor how well we're doing coexisting with the wildlife and the wild places that are here, and really trying to spur our community for further coordinated action so that we can better coexist and have really a sustainable future with the incredible wildlife that we're blessed with here.
So when you moved over to work at the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance, what was was there a specific initiative that you had in mind, or that they had in mind that they wanted you to implement? I mean, like when you wake up in the morning and walk into work, what is on your mind? Like, what is the exact, is there a set of specific problems that you are, as an individual, are focused on? Or I'm just kind of curious about exactly how you're applying all this amazing wisdom and knowledge you've garnered over the years to the work of the organization, because it seems like there's just so many different ways it could go. It's almost like, how do you focus it,
Yeah, well, it's a good question. And I think it's something that we continually talk about, is how do we focus our efforts? Where do we want to spend our time and our energies? Because they're limited. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of challenges to the wildlife and the wild places of the Greater Yellowstone. And so we do need to prioritize. Certainly regionally, geographically, we focus more on Jackson Hole, and the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is our larger regional focus. We do participate in some larger areas, like the Bridger Teton Working Group is a part of that, and that's around the Bridger Tetons National Forest. It's a national forest. They're revising their forest plan. I think to get back to your question, coming in here, my main charge is kind of, as a conservation director, is conservation on public lands. And so really focused on participating in the NEPA process on big projects on federal lands like national park or national forest lands. Also getting active in planning things like Carnes Meadow. There's a municipal park here in town. The town of Jackson owns a meadow, and they're planning to turn it into a park. And how they do that, whether they put a paved bike pathway through there, is important for the wildlife habitat that exists in that meadow. And so we get involved in those conversations around how do we best plan and conserve wildlife and wildlife habitat on public lands. My counterpart, Amy, is the planning director, and so she focuses more on private lands. We also look at private lands development. We go to planning commission meetings and town council and county commissioner meetings and make comments about developments on private lands and how that's going to impact wildlife permeability or sustainability of our open spaces here. And so we get involved with a lot of big picture decisions, like the auctioning of the Kelly parcel next to Grand Teton National Park. That's a 640 acre state parcel that abuts the national park that the state is still threatening to auction to the highest bidder. So we certainly get involved in things like that. And, I think the role that I play here is kind of as the science guy. My background is in, ecology and education, but I try to provide a scientific understanding to bring in the best available science so that we can support our conservation efforts with science to do original research or data gathering if we need to do that. Most of what we do is collaborate with other scientists and use other published research to defend our positions, to really bring the best available science to decision makers and really try to have that conversation in the community about, like I said, these critically important decisions about how we use land here, and to really try to bring a voice for conservation to those conversations.
When you mentioned collaboration and you mentioned science, and that brings me, obviously, I started thinking about the Nature Conservancy, and that is actually how you and I were introduced to the Idaho chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And I've been doing this partnership with them over the last year and this year and 2 months now, I guess. And those are the two things that are constantly hammered home, is this just need for very, very focused science combined with the need for collaboration among all stakeholders. And so I'd love to hear if there are any examples that come to mind of how you or the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance have collaborated with TNC, because it seems like there's so much alignment there.
Yeah. We work with TNC when that alignment becomes apparent, and when there's synergies involved. And so there's Wyoming chapter of TNC as well as Idaho chapter. We certainly work with Wyoming chapter when it makes sense. I have colleagues and friends over there, but I wanted to TNC's horn a little bit in being a leader in really trying to train the next force of prescribed fire practitioners. There's really a dearth of folks that know how to do prescribed fire, that understand the role of fire in ecosystems and can implement prescribed fires. It's really difficult to both have that knowledge base and experience base, and then also the burn windows, when it's safe to burn, are getting smaller and smaller and just harder and harder to implement. So TNC has been a leader in really trying to partner with the Forest Service and other NGOs like our own, and even municipalities and fire safe councils. And here we have the Teton Area Wildfire Protection Coalition that's been a part of this work. There's a large group called GYFAN. It's the Greater Yellowstone Fire Action Network. And that's a collection of mostly agencies, national park, national forests, but also NGOs, TNC, our organization got involved, in other municipalities like the Teton Area Wildfire Protection Coalition, coming together to really try to increase the pace of wildfire mitigation work on the ground, and with that being prescribed fires and fuels treatments, to actually go in and do mechanical treatments to thin the fuels or limb up the trees around residences to try to remove fuels from that defensible area zone around homes, to educate homeowners about evacuation routes and water sources and all these things that come into play when the next emergency happens. And, frankly, we need to be really honest with the residents out here. It's not a matter of if the next fire is going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And the better prepared we can be, and the more adapted our community can be to wildfire. We talk about a fire resilient landscape. So the landscape is resilient to fire. And we talk about fire adapted communities. So the communities have prepared for wildfire. They understand the natural role of fire, and they understand the risk that they run living in the wildland-urban interface. So these are all goals that we have to try to live more sustainably in the areas where we are, to allow wildfire to play its natural role, or to mimic that role with prescribed fire fuels treatments. I guess I just want to toot the Nature Conservancy's horn. I want to kind of congratulate my colleagues over there for really the hard work they've done to try to increase our capacity to do these important treatments on the ground, and to get the word out that fire is a critical part of these ecosystems, and we need to accommodate it to have a healthy future.
Well, they obviously want to toot your horn too. So that's the cool thing about working. Working with TNC and getting to really understand but also how they do things. And I think these partnerships are just, they're the basis of everything. You could have all the best science in the world, but without I think they talk about, building relationships at the speed of trust, and the people on the ground doing the work. That's where it all meets up, and you're right there on the front line. It's really, really cool to hear about. Kind of a more philosophical question for you. In your bio on the website, it says that so much of your career, you feel like you've indirectly contributed to conservation, and now at the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance, you're directly doing it. And so I was wondering how do you think about that shift? How has it been over the last, relatively, compared to the rest of your career, relatively short time doing this direct work, but has it measured up to everything you hoped it would?
I've really enjoyed it. And the first year has gone really fast. It surprised me that it had been a year already. And I'm excited. I'm excited for the next year. And frankly, it feels good to try to make an impact, to really try to make a difference on the ground. As I mentioned earlier, I feel so strongly that the decisions we make about what we do on the ground, how we use land, are so critical. Now I get to play a role in trying to influence that directly. And that's not to say I haven't loved my prior careers of doing research to really try to answer questions about, say, aspen reproduction or the natural role of fire in an ecosystem, or education has been a love of mine to try to get people excited about the natural world, or connected to the natural world, or just understand the natural role of how an ecosystem works, how the organisms interact, and then humans' dependence on our ecosystems has been a critical part of what I try to impart to my students. I've been thrilled to maybe play a small role in moving conservation forward. And I'm excited to put my full efforts into this moving forward.
I'd love to hear more about your personal background and how you ended up doing this work, because we were saying before I started recording that when I was 23 and I'd been on Knowles, I had this bug that I wanted to be doing, stuff related to the West or to the outdoors, but I didn't really know how to go about doing it. So there I was sitting in Merrill Lynch wearing a suit, trying to be a stockbroker. And I'd read stories about people like you doing this cool work. And I was just so intrigued as to how you ended up doing that. And so you're born in Colorado Springs, then we're out in California. Was the outdoors and conservation always a part of your life, or was there some kind of moment when it became a part of your life?
That's a good question. I always enjoyed the outdoors, but I think I really became connected to it more in a serious way of thinking about it as a career in college. I got into backpacking. I had summer jobs that were close to the mountains, and just discovered my love of the forests. And, I always knew I wanted to do something that made a difference. And the first part of my career was really around, I think, making a difference to people in education. And then I wanted to learn more myself. And I had been teaching about science, but I really hadn't studied to be a scientist myself. And so I wanted to go back to graduate school and become a scientist. And the forest had been a place I had loved and used as a classroom. And so I wanted to study the forest. And I guess I had always loved fire. I'd always been a bit of a pyromaniac and loved fireworks and fire. And so forest and fire, and really Yellowstone, that fire, I was a kid when that happened, but it was indelible in my mind. And many years later, when I instructed outward bound courses, it was in the Greater Yellowstone, the Beartooth Mountains of Montana. And on my way there, I drove through Yellowstone and I saw the regenerating stands of lodgepole. And it just reminded me, that fire, that wasn't what we thought it was. And so that it's all connected. And that brought me back to grad school to study fire in forests. And then that led me to the Tetons to take a job at the Teton Science Schools, where I was doing research and teaching in a graduate program. And that I fell in love with the Tetons and the Greater Yellowstone. And now I get to work to try to conserve this place and make this place available to our grandkids and to hope that these iconic herds of wildlife will be around for many, many generations to come.
Can you tell me more about your early career in experiential education? Because we were talking before we started recording. We both did semesters with the National Outdoor Leadership School. And I just feel like that was such a formative part of my life. And it seems like it was for you. I guess the question would be, how did your time at Outward Bound, how has that informed your work now? Because I would think that between your work as a teacher and then your work at Outward Bound, work as a teacher, this ability to communicate complex issues in a way that connects with people, I think that's so important, especially for scientists. Can you talk a bit about how your early career in education, whether outdoor or in the classroom, has affected your ability to be so great at your job now?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. You're making some assumptions there, but I appreciate it.
No, I've done my research. I know it's true.
Okay, appreciate it. It's a good question, and looking back, it all kind of makes sense. But going through it wasn't a straight line. It was circuitous, and I had good advice growing up, and from my parents to follow what I loved, and that's kind of, I guess, what I did. Experiential education for me, I was a student of experiential education in high school and then in college, and then that Knowles course and Outward Bound. It was a really powerful way of learning for me. I wanted to be a part of that for someone else. And I think the foundation of that runs through all of this is observation. Being out in the woods, or experiential education is about being out there yourself, experiencing it yourself. Such a powerful teacher, experience and emotion. And I learned a lot about that in Outward Bound, both through, going through those experiences myself as a student, but then also trying to emulate those experiences for my students as an instructor. I'm learning a ton about resilience and flexibility, because those courses are really hard and they never go as planned. And you have to really dig deep and understand yourself and be flexible. And just kind of understand how situations change, deal with the changing circumstances, and make decisions kind of on the fly. And so I think that those skills have been tremendously useful. That the power of experience has been a thread that's run through my career as an educator. After I did Outward Bound, I came to San Francisco and taught high school. I thought I would do it for a year. I ended up doing it for 5 years. It was probably the most challenging and rewarding thing that I've done. And there I tried to bring a lot of the Outward Bound stuff to my students. I started an outdoor leadership program and took these city kids into the ecosystems of California to learn about, just basically all the different ecosystems and the complexity, and frankly, to learn about themselves a lot. And and then I kind of, I love teaching high school. It was super challenging, really rewarding, still in touch with some of my students. I went from there, I went back to school myself, and that's where I kind of tried to enact this. Like, I was teaching science, but I hadn't really learned to be a scientist myself. And so I went back to study forest and fire, and to really learn to the careful art and science of doing a Ph.D. And that was a great experience. And I think that, all the threads of my different careers they link together to lead where I am now. And so the experiential part of my Outward Bound experience, and then the education and communication piece of my time in the classroom, and then the knowledge that I gained from being in the field, teaching in a graduate program and doing research here in the Tetons, just the time I got in the field to experience this place and get to know this place. Those are all serving me now in my role as conservation director, where I need to communicate science. I need to maybe do a little bit of science. I need to write persuasively, but I need to also write scientifically. I need to, talk to stakeholders. I need to try to convince folks of things. I need to bring the best available science. So I'm trying to do a lot of different things. And I feel like, even though my path has been very circuitous, the pieces fit together really well to serve my goals right now in my work here at the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance. So a very circuitous answer, but maybe I got.
Well, I love that.
To the answer there.
I think that's so instructive to people, because I was actually just talking to my wife last night. We were talking about somebody that a kid that's getting ready to go to college, and just very, very specific about, I need to major in this because I want to do this and I want this to be my job. And I think your story is such an example of that. There was no grand planned to go, when you were 17, it doesn't sound like there was a grand plan to go and eventually get your PhD and focus on forest science, but here you are. And so I imagine you get, especially when you're teaching and in academia, that people would approach you looking for advice. And so what would be your advice to somebody, say, in undergrad, that looking for some advice on where to go? Because it's, your story is one of kind of following passion, following curiosity, working extremely hard along the way. And it's been this extremely rewarding career. What do you tell like a 20-year-old that's looking for career advice?
Yeah. I mean, frankly, I think I try to give them some of the same good advice that was given to me, is that, to follow your heart, follow what you love. I think, maybe I have a little more practicality now that's like, well, you also need to pay the bills. And if you want to have a family, like, you got to think about that as well. And maybe I didn't, that stuff is all worked out really well. So I'm not regretting anything, but I think, there's not, I can't tell someone which way to go, but what I can tell them is to listen to themselves, to really try to understand what they love, to really try to think about what they're passionate about. And also I think what I would say now, which wasn't said to me, but I think maybe a newer reality, is that, like, you're probably not going to have one career. I don't know. I'm now on my third or fourth, depending on how you count. You're probably going to have multiple different things that you do. And, in my case, those things have certainly kind of built upon each other, and they're synergistic in that the skills are transferable, and the knowledge is sometimes useful in different domains. So maybe that takes some pressure off. You're not choosing just one thing. Maybe you're just choosing the first thing you want to do. I would say that. And of course, I would want to just spend time with the person to see, who they are before I would give any kind of advice to them. But really, I think it's about following the passion, understanding that there's lots of opportunities out there. And I guess, the other piece I would say is really like make connections with people. Be curious, make connections with people, and understand that it's not just, a good application, but it's interacting with people and building a social network, getting referred to one job from another and doing good work. It'll be a virtuous cycle that will build on itself.
I completely agree with that, especially in the conservation community, because it can be such a small world, surprisingly small world. And there are a lot of people that want to be in it. And if you can build these relationships with people, solid relationships over a long period of time, these opportunities just present themselves. So that's great advice. I'd love to know any books that you've read over the years that have kind of contributed to your view on conservation or really just life. It doesn't have to be books directly related to the West or to conservation, but any books that have played a big role in your development as a human?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Two that I want to recommend. The first is, it probably has been recommended by other guests. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. I'm sure you've read it.
Somebody just sent me that. Actually, Carissa Bussey from TNC mailed it because everybody keeps recommending it. I haven't read it, so I need to read it.
And you should, if you can, get Robin Wall Kimmerer on your show. She is incredible. I have not met her. She reads the audiobook. It's really, and she is a professor. I'm not going to say where because I don't remember, but she has Native ancestry, but she's also been trained as a Western scientist. And this book does an incredible job of weaving together both traditional ecological knowledge and Western science. Everyone should read that book. Yeah. And then the other one, this is more personally, is called When Things Fall Apart. And
that's one of my favorites.
Children. That's been a game changer. And to relate it back to what we talked about today, one of the I think very cool things about fire as an ecological process is that it is the destroyer, but it also is rebirth, right? And that's kind of what this book is about, is that like things fall apart. That's just the nature of our world. How do we deal with that as humans? Incredible book, and really has been instructive for me in hard times. And so I would recommend that for anyone going through hard times.
I think Pema Chodron may be the wisest human walking the earth today. I kind of stand by that. I every single thing, I've got like all her books. I've got a vast majority of them on audiobook, and I listen to them on repeat. And she is so, and she doesn't take herself too seriously either. She's kind of funny and kind of irreverent at times for you wouldn't think that of a Buddhist nun, but she has improved my life. It's amazing. I think you might be the first person to mention that book on this podcast, which is, I love it.
Well, I'm reading it for the second time now, and I'm getting more out of it. So yeah, I can understand why you listen to it on repeat for sure.
I gave it to a buddy of mine who's been on the podcast, who's a professional ultra marathon runner, and he loved it. And he said that's kind of the, if you could really summarize professional ultra running or 100-mile race, that's a good way to do it, is because things definitely fall apart quickly during a 100-mile race.
Well, I was going to just say, it'd be interesting to see how different people view that book. I think everyone could take that book and say, oh, this is exactly how, ultra marathons are. This is exactly how the stock market works, or this is exactly how marriage is. It really is. That's how life works. That's how ecosystems work as well. So I think it's just, there's so much wisdom in there.
I agree completely. There could be a whole podcast series. That's a good idea for a podcast, actually. All right. 2 more questions for you. Second to last is if you could if you have any parting words of wisdom for the listeners of this podcast. And we were talking a bit before we started recording, and it's people who are interested in the West in one way or the other. They feel a connection to this place. They feel a connection to the land, whether that's through conservation or agriculture or literature, art. And so any kind of parting words for the listeners?
Let's see. I probably don't need to tell this to folks that love the West, but my parting advice is just to get outside and just learn to love the place where you live.
Yep. I agree. That's what Knowles did for me. And that's what you did as an experiential educator is planting that seed, because nobody's going to protect something they don't care about. And that's the first step, is getting outside. I love that. Last question. How can people find out about and hopefully support the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance? Where do they need to go? What do you guys need? How can people help?
Oh, well, thanks for asking that. But they can go to jhalliance.org. Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance. If you Google that, you'll come to our webpage. We've got an active blog, so read our blog to see what's happening here in Jackson and what challenges there are for the wildlife, wild places, and community character of Jackson Hole. Certainly there's a donate button on the webpage if you have the means. We certainly operate off of the generosity of donors. And come out and support us at one of our events, read one of our publications, and frankly, just get active in your own community for the wildlife and the wild places, and you'll be accomplishing our mission.
Well, thank you, Kevin. This is awesome, man. I hope we can hang out in person one of these days. I'll let you know when I'm up that way next. But I really admire everything you're doing and how you go about doing it. And I'm so thankful that TNC introduced us, and keep up the good work.
Well, Ed, thank you so much for the opportunity to be on your podcast. And I would say keep up your amazing work as well. Thank you so much for the privilege.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way, so head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.